Captain Jake Morrison woke up to the sound of alarms screaming through his ship, and for a moment, he just lay there in his bunk, wondering what had gone wrong this time, because something always went wrong on the old freighter he called home. He rolled out of bed and his feet hit the cold metal floor, and he grabbed his pants from where he had thrown them the night before and pulled them on, while the alarm kept wailing like a sick animal. The control panel on his wall showed that the motion sensors in Cargo Bay 7 had triggered, and that made no sense at all, because he had not loaded anything into that bay before leaving the station, and the entire section should have been empty and sealed. Jake grabbed his plasma pistol from the drawer beside his bed and checked the charge, and it glowed green, so he knew he had at least 30 shots if he needed them, and he hoped he would not need them, because shooting holes in your own cargo bay was never a good idea. He made his way down the narrow corridor that connected the living quarters to the rest of the ship, and his boots made loud clanging sounds with each step, and the walls around him hummed with the sound of the engines pushing them through hyperspace. The ship was old and small and nothing fancy, but it was his, and he had spent the last 15 years hauling cargo from one end of the colonies to the other, and making just enough money to keep flying, and that was all he wanted from life. Jake reached the cargo bay door and stopped to check the scanner one more time, and it still showed movement inside, and his heart started beating faster, because stowaways were rare, but they happened, and sometimes they were dangerous. He took a deep breath and hit the release button, and the door hissed open and cold air rushed out from the bay, because he kept the cargo sections cooler to save on power, and he stepped inside with his pistol raised. The bay was dark except for the emergency lights that cast long shadows across the stacks of empty cargo containers and old equipment, and Jake moved slowly between the rows looking for whatever had triggered the alarm. Then he heard it, and it was a soft sound, like breathing, but not quite human, and it came from the far corner behind a stack of medical supply crates that he had been meaning to sell at the next station. Jake moved closer and raised his pistol, and his finger rested on the trigger, and he came around the corner of the crates, and then he froze, because what he saw made no sense at all. There was a woman huddled on the floor, and she was pressing herself against the wall like she was trying to disappear into it, and she wore absolutely nothing, and her skin was so pale it almost glowed in the dim light. But that was not the strangest part, because her ears came to sharp points that swept back through hair that looked like liquid silver, and her eyes, when she looked up at him, were completely silver too, with no white or iris, just pure, metallic silver that caught the light. On her shoulders sat two small creatures that looked like miniature dragons, and they were about the size of house cats, and their scales shimmered red and orange like fire, and their eyes glowed amber in the darkness, and they made soft chirping sounds. The woman looked at Jake, and her eyes went wide with fear, and she held up her hands like she expected him to shoot her, and she started speaking in a language he had never heard before, and it sounded like music and bells and running water all mixed together. Jake lowered his pistol slowly, because whatever this woman was, she was clearly terrified, and the little dragons on her shoulders were making distressed sounds, and one of them spread its tiny wings like it was trying to protect her. Then something incredible happened, because the woman's voice changed, and suddenly Jake could understand her, even though she was still speaking that strange musical language, and the words just appeared in his mind like someone was translating directly into his thoughts. She said her name was Luna, and she was sorry for hiding on his ship, but she had nowhere else to go, and there were hunters after her, and they wanted to take her and her dragons back to the core worlds and do terrible things to them. Jake stood there trying to process what was happening, because this was beyond anything he had ever experienced, and he had seen a lot of strange things in 15 years of flying the outer colonies, but nothing like this. Luna kept talking, and her voice in his mind was desperate and frightened, and she explained that her people were called the Silvery, and they had been hiding among the stars for thousands of years, and most humans did not even know they existed. She said that she and her bonded dragons had escaped from a research facility on one of the core worlds where scientists were studying her people and trying to figure out how they could bond with the ancient dragons and use that power for military purposes. The Silvari could do things that seemed like magic, but were really just a deeper connection to the energy that flowed through all living things. And when they bonded with dragons, that power grew stronger, and the core world governments wanted to control it. Luna had been held in that facility for 2 years, and they had done tests on her and on her dragons, and she showed Jake her arms, and he could see faint scars running up and down her pale skin, and his stomach turned at the thought of what they had done to her. 3 days ago she had managed to escape during a power failure, and she had run through the station with her dragons, and she had hidden in cargo containers and maintenance shafts, and finally she had found his ship sitting in Dock Bay 12 with its cargo door open. She had slipped inside and hidden in the emptiest section she could find, and she had stayed quiet when the ship took off, and she had hoped that maybe she could reach the edge colonies where the core worlds had less control, and where she might be safe. Jake listened to all of this, and he looked at the woman shivering on his cargo bay floor with her silver hair, and her strange, beautiful face, and her 2 little dragons trying to keep her warm, and he made a decision. He took off his jacket and tossed it to her, and then he turned his back to give her privacy, while she put it on, and he could hear her moving behind him, and the soft sounds of the dragons chirping. When he turned around again, Luna had wrapped herself in his jacket and had hung down to her knees, and she looked at him with those silver eyes full of hope and fear, and she waited for him to tell her what he was going to do. Jake holstered his pistol, and he looked at Luna, and he thought about all the things he had seen the core worlds do to people who were different, or who had something the government wanted, and he had never liked it, but he had always looked the other way because it was safer. But something about this woman and her desperate courage and the way her little dragons looked at him with their glowing eyes made him want to take a risk for once in his careful life. He told Luna that she could stay on his ship until they reached the edge colonies, and he would not turn her in no matter what rewards they might offer, and he saw her face transform with relief and gratitude. Luna started crying, and the tears ran down her pale cheeks, and she thanked him over in that musical language, and the dragons on her shoulders made happy chirping sounds and spread their tiny wings. Jake helped her to her feet and led her out of the cargo bay toward the living quarters, and he gave her his spare cabin and told her she could rest there, and he would bring her some food and clothes as he walked back to the bridge. Jake wondered what he had just gotten himself into, because harboring a fugitive from the core worlds was serious business, and if they caught him they would take his ship and probably throw him in prison for years. But when he thought about Luna's silver eyes and her scars and her terror, he knew he had made the right choice, even if it cost him everything, because some things were more important than playing it safe. Jake sat down in his captain's chair and checked their course, and they were 3 days out from the nearest edge colony station, and he just had to keep Luna hidden until then and hope that nobody came looking. He had no idea that his simple act of kindness was about to change his life forever, and earn him the loyalty of an entire fleet of dragon riders who would follow him to the end of time itself. Jake spent the next hour finding clothes for Luna, and the only things he had that might fit were an old jumpsuit and some shirts that would be too big on her, but better than nothing, and he gathered them along with some food from his small kitchen. He knocked on the cabin door, and Luna opened it, and she was still wearing his jacket. But she looked less frightened now, and the 2 dragons were perched on the edge of the bed watching him with curious amber eyes. Jake handed her the clothes and a plate of food that was just reheated rations, but it was all he had, and Luna took them with both hands and looked at the food like she had not eaten in days, which she probably had not. She thanked him again in that musical language, and Jake found himself getting used to the way her words translated directly into his thoughts, and it was strange but also kind of wonderful to understand someone so perfectly without any confusion. He told her she should eat and rest, and they would talk more later, and then he left her alone and went back to the bridge to check on their course and make sure no other ships were following them. The next day, Jake was working on some repairs in the engine room when he felt a presence behind him, and he turned to find Luna standing there wearing the jumpsuit he had given her, and it fit her surprisingly well, and her silver hair was tied back in a simple braid. The dragons, Spark and Ember, she had called them, were perched on her shoulders like always, and Jake was starting to realize they never left her side, and the bond between them must be incredibly strong. Luna asked if she could help him with anything, because she did not want to just hide in the cabin and do nothing while he risked everything to protect her, and Jake thought about it and decided that having an extra pair of hands would actually be useful. He showed her how to check the coolant levels in the engine, and she picked it up immediately, like her mind was designed to absorb information and she asked intelligent questions about how everything worked and why it was built this way. Over the next few hours, they worked together in comfortable silence, and Jake found himself enjoying her company more than he had enjoyed anyone in a long time, because most of his life was spent alone on this ship talking to himself. Luna told him more about her people while they worked, and she explained that the Silvery had left their home world thousands of years ago when it became clear that their presence was causing problems with the younger species who feared their powers. They had taken to the stars in great ships, and they had settled on hidden worlds in the far reaches of space, where they could live in peace and continue their ancient traditions of bonding with dragons and studying the mysteries of the universe. The dragons were not native to the Silvari homeworld, but came from another dimension entirely, and they could only enter this reality through a bond with a Silvari host, and once bonded, they shared thoughts and feelings and even life force. When a Silvari bonded with a dragon, they would live for centuries instead of decades, and their powers would grow stronger with each passing year, and the dragon would grow larger and more powerful as well, until some of them became the size of small ships. Luna had bonded with Spark and Ember when she was very young, and they were still babies themselves, and normally they would have grown much larger by now, but the experiments at the research facility had stunted their growth and damaged their connection. She showed Jake a device that had been implanted in her neck, and it was a small metal disc about the size of a coin, and it suppressed her powers and prevented the dragons from growing properly, and the scientist had put it there to keep her under control. Jake looked at the device and felt anger rising in his chest, because this was exactly the kind of thing the core worlds did to people they considered valuable property, and he asked Luna if it could be removed. She said it could, but it would require surgery and specialized equipment, and if it was removed incorrectly, it could kill her or sever her bond with the dragons permanently. And so she had been afraid to try. Jake thought about this for a moment, and then he remembered that one of the edge colonies he was heading toward had a medical station run by independent doctors who did not ask questions and who might be willing to help. He told Luna about this, and her silver eyes lit up with hope, and she asked if he really thought they would help her. And Jake said he would make sure of it, even if he had to pay them every credit he had saved. That evening, Jake made dinner for both of them, and they sat in the small galley eating and talking, and Luna told him stories about her home world and the great forests where her people lived among trees that were thousands of feet tall. She described cities built in the canopy, where bridges of living wood connected massive platforms, and where dragons flew between the towers like birds, and where the Silvari studied art and music and philosophy for centuries at a time. Jake told her about his own life and how he had grown up on a colony world where his parents had worked in the mines, and how he had saved every credit to buy this ship and escape that life and find freedom among the stars. Luna listened to his story with the same attention he had given hers, and she said that freedom was precious and worth fighting for, and that she understood why he valued it so much, because her people had given up everything to be free. The dragons, Spark and Ember, had warmed up to Jake over the course of the day, and now they were sitting on the table between him and Luna, making soft chirping sounds and occasionally stealing bits of food from his plate. Jake laughed and pushed some food toward them, and they ate it delicately with their small, sharp teeth, and their scales shimmered in the light, and he could see tiny wisps of smoke coming from their nostrils. Luna explained that the dragons were fire breathers, but because of their stunted growth, they could only produce small flames right now, and normally, by their age, they would be able to melt steel with their breath. She reached out and stroked Ember's head, and the little dragon closed its eyes and made a sound like a cat purring, and Jake could see the deep love between them, and it made him think about how lonely his own life had become. On the second day, Luna insisted on learning how to pilot the ship, and Jake was hesitant at first because the controls were complex and it had taken him years to master them, but Luna was persistent. He showed her the basic navigation systems and the helm controls, and within an hour, she was flying the ship better than some pilots he had known for years, and her movements were smooth and natural, like she was dancing with the machine. Jake asked her how she was learning so fast, and Luna explained that the Silvari had a different kind of mind than humans, and they could see patterns and connections that others missed, and once they understood the underlying principles of something, they could master it quickly. She took the ship through a series of maneuvers that made Jake's stomach flip, and the whole time she was smiling, and her silver eyes were bright with joy, and the dragons on her shoulders were chirping excitedly. Jake realized that Luna had probably been locked up for so long that this simple act of flying through space felt like the greatest freedom in the universe, and he was glad he could give her that, even if it was just for a little while. That night Jake could not sleep, and he lay in his bunk thinking about what would happen when they reached the colony, and whether Luna would be safe there, and whether he was doing enough to help her. He got up and walked through the quiet ship, and he found Luna standing on the bridge, looking out at the stars through the main viewport, and the dragons were curled up asleep on the console beside her. She turned when she heard him, and she smiled and said she could not sleep either because she kept thinking about what it would be like to be free again, and whether she deserved Jake's help after everything that had happened. Jake told her that everyone deserved help, and that what the core worlds had done to her was wrong, and that he would do everything in his power to make sure she reached safety. Luna looked at him with those silver eyes, and she said something that he would remember for the rest of his life. And she said that humans were strange creatures because they were young and violent and often selfish, but sometimes they showed kindness that was so pure and unexpected that it changed everything. She said that Jake had given her hope when she had none, and that his simple act of compassion had reminded her why the Silvery had always believed that younger species like humanity were worth protecting and guiding. Jake did not know what to say to that, so he just stood beside her, and they watched the stars together in silence. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered if he had just made a friend who would change his life forever. On the third day, everything changed, and it started when Jake and Luna were eating breakfast in the galley, and the proximity alarm went off, and that was never a good sign when you were traveling through hyperspace. Jake ran to the bridge with Luna. Right behind him, and Spark and Ember were making alarm chirping sounds from her shoulders, and when he checked the scanner, his heart sank, because there were 3 ships waiting for them at the exit point. They were military cruisers from the core world's fleet, and they were positioned right where his ship would drop out of hyperspace, and there was no way to avoid them or turn back. Now Jake cursed under his breath, and Luna came to stand beside him, and her face had gone pale because she knew exactly why those ships were there. And she said she was sorry and that she had brought this danger to him. Jake told her it was not her fault, and that he had made his choice to help her, and he was not going to back down now just because things got dangerous, and he started thinking fast about what he could do. The ship dropped out of hyperspace, and immediately all 3 cruisers lit up their weapon systems and locked targeting on Jake's small freighter. And a voice came over the communication, channel cold and official. The voice identified itself as Commander Richard Hale of the Core World's military, and he demanded that Jake surrender the fugitive Silveri female immediately, or his ship would be destroyed as an accomplice to her crimes. Jake looked at Luna and saw fear in her silver eyes, but also resignation, like she had expected this to happen. And she told him he should just hand her over and save himself because she was not worth dying for. But Jake had never been good at doing what he was told, and he had spent his whole life watching the core worlds push people around and take what they wanted, and he was tired of it, and something inside him snapped. He opened a channel back to the commander, and he told him in no uncertain terms that Luna was under his protection, and if they wanted her, they would have to go through him first. The commander laughed and said that Jake was a fool, and that one small freighter could not stand against 3 military cruisers, and that he had 10 seconds to comply or be destroyed. Jake did not waste those 10 seconds arguing, and instead he did something crazy, and he opened a ship-wide broadcast channel that would reach every vessel in the sector, and every communication relay, and every station within range. He started talking, and his voice went out across the void, and he told Luna's story to everyone who would listen, and he described the research facility and the experiments and the way the core worlds were hunting an entire species just because they were different. He talked about the scars on her arms and the device implanted in her neck, and the way they had stunted the growth of her dragons and tried to turn her into a weapon they could control. Luna stood beside him with tears streaming down her face, and she was shaking. But she reached out and took his hand and squeezed it, and the dragons on her shoulders spread their tiny wings like they were ready to fight. Jake's words spread like wildfire across the communication networks, and ships that were nearby started picking up the broadcast and relaying it further. And within minutes, thousands of people were hearing the truth about what the core worlds were doing. The commander tried to jam the signal, but it was too late. And the story was out there, and Jake kept talking, and he challenged anyone who was listening to come and stand with him against this injustice. For a long moment nothing happened, and Jake thought maybe he had just signed his own death warrant and the cruisers were powering up their weapons and he could see the energy reading spiking on his scanner. Then something incredible happened, and a ship jumped into the system, and then another, and then 5 more, and they were all independent vessels and traders and small cargo haulers like his own. The ships positioned themselves between Jake's freighter and the military cruisers, and their captains opened channels declaring that they would not allow this injustice to stand, and that they were protecting Jake, and Luna. More ships kept arriving, and soon there were 17 vessels forming a protective wall, and some of them had weapons, and some did not, but they all stayed in formation and refused to move. Commander Hale was furious, and his voice came back over the channel threatening consequences and saying that everyone who was protecting Jake would be charged as criminals, and their ships would be confiscated. But one of the other captains, a woman named Beth Carter, who ran a medical transport, responded, and her voice was calm and steady, and she said that the whole sector had just heard what the core worlds were doing, and that public opinion had shifted. She said that if the commander attacked now, he would be starting a fight with 17 ships full of witnesses, and that the story would spread even further, and that the core worlds would lose more than they could gain. Jake watched the scanner as the military cruisers held their position, and he could almost feel the commander weighing his options and calculating whether this was worth the political cost. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the cruisers powered down their weapons and the commander came back on the channel, and his voice was cold with rage. He said that this was not over, and that Jake and everyone who had helped him would face consequences, and that the core worlds had long memories. And then the 3 cruisers turned and jumped back into hyperspace. The moment they were gone, Jake let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, and Luna collapsed into the captain's chair, and the dragons were making distressed sounds and trying to comfort her. The other ships started hailing. Jake and their captains wanted to know if he was all right, and whether Luna was safe, and many of them offered to escort him to the colony station to make sure no one else tried to intercept them. Jake thanked them all, and his voice was rough with emotion, and he told them they had just saved 2 lives and maybe changed the course of history. And Beth Carter laughed and said that sometimes ordinary people had to stand up to power over the next few hours as they traveled to the colony station. Jake and Luna sat together on the bridge, and they did not talk much because there were no words for what had just happened. Luna kept looking at Jake like she could not quite believe he was real, and finally she said that no one had ever stood up for her people like that, and that most beings would have just handed her over to save themselves. Jake told her that he had just done what anyone should do, and that standing by while innocent people suffered was the same as helping the people who hurt them, and he could not live with that. Luna smiled through her tears, and she said that humans always underestimated themselves and that they had no idea how powerful simple courage could be, and how it could inspire others to be brave too. Then, something unexpected appeared on the scanner, and it was a single ship. But it was unlike anything Jake had ever seen, and it was sleek and elegant, and it shimmered with colors that seemed to shift and change. The ship hailed them, and a voice came through that sounded like Luna's, but older and filled with authority. And the voice said that the Silvery had heard what happened, and they were coming. Luna gasped, and her hands flew to her mouth, and she said something in her language that Jake did not understand. And the dragon Spark and Ember started making excited chirping sounds. More ships began appearing, and they were all silvery vessels, and they were beautiful beyond description. And there were dozens of them, and then hundreds, and they formed up around Jake's small freighter like an honor guard. The largest ship requested permission to dock, and Jake granted it, and he and Luna went to the airlock to meet whoever was coming aboard, and Luna was trembling with emotion. The airlock opened, and a group of Silvari walked through, and they were all tall and graceful, and their skin glowed with inner light, and massive dragons walked beside them, and their scales were every color imaginable. At the front of the group was a woman who looked both ancient and young at the same time, and her silver hair fell to the ground, and her eyes held the wisdom of centuries. She walked directly to Jake, and then she did something that shocked him completely, and she bowed deeply, and the other Silvari, and even the great dragons bowed with her. The elder woman straightened, and she spoke, and her voice filled Jake's mind with warmth and gratitude. and she said that he had done what no outsider had ever done before. She said that Jake had protected one of their people without asking for anything in return, and that he had risked his life and his freedom to save Luna, when her own people could not reach her in time. By the oldest laws of the Sylvari, this created a debt that could never be fully repaid, and from this day forward, Jake Morrison would be considered a friend to all their kind. The elder declared that the Sylvari fleet would answer Jake's call whenever he needed them, and their warriors and their dragons would fight beside him. Until the stars grew cold and the universe ended, Jake tried to protest, and he said he had just done what was right and that he did not deserve this kind of honor. But Luna took his hand and she smiled at him with joy in her silver eyes. She told him that humans never understood the power of their own kindness, and that was what made them special, and that Jake had earned something that very few beings in all of history had ever earned: the loyalty of the Dragon Riders until the end of time itself. The Sylvari remained docked with Jake's ship for the next several hours, and he found himself surrounded by beings who treated him like some kind of hero, when all he had done was refuse to hand over a frightened woman to people who wanted to hurt her. The elder, whose name was Kira, explained that the Sylvari had been monitoring the core world's activities for years, and they knew about the research facilities and the experiments, but they had been unable to act openly without starting a war. When Luna escaped, they had been searching for her desperately and trying to track her movements, but she had been clever and stayed hidden until she reached Jake's ship, and by then it was almost too late. Kira told Jake that if he had not broadcast Luna's story and rallied those other ships to protect them, the military cruisers would have destroyed his ship and taken Luna, and no one would have ever known what happened. But now the truth was spreading across the entire sector and beyond, and the core worlds could not silence it, and the political pressure was mounting for them to shut down the research programs and free any other Sylvari they held captive. Jake listened to all of this while sitting in his small galley that was now crowded with Sylvari and dragons of all sizes, and he still could not quite believe this was happening to him. One of the younger Sylvari warriors, a man named Darian, approached Jake and said he wanted to shake the hand of the human who had shown such courage, and when Jake extended his hand, Darian gripped it firmly. Darian said that his own sister had been taken by the core worlds 5 years ago, and they had never found her, and hearing Luna's story had given him hope that maybe she was still alive somewhere. Jake told him he hoped his sister would be found, and that maybe now with the pressure mounting the core worlds would have to reveal what they had done with all the Sylvari they had captured. Other Sylvari came forward with their own stories, and Jake realized that this was not just about Luna but about dozens or maybe hundreds of their people who had been taken over the years. The Sylvari had lived in secret for so long, trying to avoid conflict with younger species, but that secrecy had made them vulnerable because when their people disappeared there was no one to speak for them. Luna sat beside Jake through all of this, and she was reunited with friends and family she had not seen in years, and the joy on her face was beautiful to watch. The dragons Spark and Ember were the center of attention among the other dragons, who seemed concerned about their small size and stunted growth, and several of the larger dragons gently nuzzled them and made soft, rumbling sounds. Kira examined the suppression device in Luna's neck, and she said she could remove it, but it would take time and careful work, and she wanted to wait until they reached the colony station where she could use proper medical equipment. Jake offered his ship for the procedure, but Kira said the Sylvari medical vessel would be better equipped, and that Luna would be in good hands, and Jake trusted her because she clearly cared deeply about her people. As the gathering continued, Jake found himself talking with various Sylvari about their lives and their culture, and he learned that they were not just warriors and mystics but also artists and scientists and philosophers. One elderly Sylvari showed Jake a hologram of their hidden homeworld, and it was breathtaking, with forests that stretched across entire continents and cities, built among the trees that glowed with soft light. The Sylvari explained that their world was protected by powerful shields that made it invisible to scanners, and that only those who were brought there by a Sylvari could ever find it. Jake asked if he would ever see it, and the Sylvari smiled and said that as a friend of their people, he would always be welcome, and that Luna herself would probably want to bring him there someday. Luna overheard this, and she nodded enthusiastically and said that Jake had to see her home and meet her family and see the great dragon nesting grounds where Spark and Ember were born. Eventually the gathering wound down, and the Silvari began returning to their own ships, and Kira took Luna with her to the medical vessel to begin the process of removing the suppression device. Before she left, Luna hugged Jake tightly, and the dragons chirped sadly at having to leave him, and Luna promised she would return as soon as the procedure was done. Jake stood in his empty ship after they all left, and for the first time in hours he was alone. And he sat down in his captain's chair and tried to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago he had been a simple cargo hauler making routine runs between colonies, and now he was friends with an entire fleet of dragon riders and had somehow earned their eternal loyalty. He pulled up the communication logs and saw that his broadcast about Luna had been viewed millions of times, and that news organizations were picking up the story and demanding answers from the core world's government. There were already protests forming on several major stations and colonies, and people were calling for investigations into the research programs and the treatment of non-human species. Jake had never wanted to be famous or to change the galaxy, and he certainly had never expected that hiding one frightened woman on his ship would lead to all of this. But as he sat there looking out at the Silvari fleet that surrounded his small freighter, he realized that sometimes the most important moments in history started with simple acts of kindness. The next day, Luna returned to his ship, and she looked different, because the suppression device was gone and there was a small bandage on her neck. But more than that, she seemed lighter. Somehow she told Jake that the removal had been successful, and that she could already feel her connection to Spark and Ember growing stronger, and that they would begin growing properly now. The dragons were noticeably more energetic, and they flew around the bridge instead of just perching on Luna's shoulders, and small wisps of flame came from their mouths when they chirped. Luna said it would take time for them to reach their full size, but that eventually they would be large enough for her to ride, and that she wanted Jake to be there when that happened. They reached the colony station later that day, and it was chaos because word of what had happened had spread, and there were reporters and protesters and core worlds, officials all crowding the docking bays. The Silvari fleet formed a protective barrier around the station and made it clear that no one would be allowed to threaten Jake or Luna, and the colony's governor came out personally to welcome them. The governor was a stern woman named Patricia Hayes, but she had kind eyes, and she told Jake that what he had done took real courage, and that the colonies had always resented the core world's heavy-handed tactics. She offered Jake and Luna sanctuary on the colony for as long as they needed, and she said that the Silvari fleet was welcome to remain in orbit, and that she would refuse any core world's demands to hand them over. Jake thanked her but said he needed to get back to work eventually because he still had a ship to maintain and bills to pay, and Patricia laughed and said that after what he had done, she doubted he would ever lack for work. She was right, because over the next few days Jake was contacted by dozens of independent traders and colony organizations who wanted to hire him for cargo runs and other jobs. Apparently, being the human who earned the loyalty of the dragon riders made him very popular, and everyone wanted to say they had worked with him. Luna stayed on his ship during this time, and she said she wanted to continue traveling with him if he would have her, because she had spent 2 years locked in a research facility, and she wanted to see the galaxy. Jake agreed immediately, because he had gotten used to her company and the ship felt empty when she was not there. And besides, Spark and Ember had claimed his quarters as their favorite sleeping spot. The Silvari fleet prepared to depart after a week, and Kira came to say goodbye to Jake, and she gave him a crystal pendant that glowed with inner light. She explained that the crystal was linked to the Silvari communication network, and if Jake ever needed help, all he had to do was hold it and speak his need, and the nearest Silvari ships would come. Jake took the pendant, and he felt the weight of it, not just physically but symbolically, because this represented a bond that transcended species and culture, and it humbled him. Kira told him that the Silvari did not give such gifts lightly, and that in all their long history only a handful of outsiders had ever earned one, and Jake should be proud. Luna hugged her elder and promised to visit home soon and to bring Jake with her, and Kira smiled and said she looked forward to it. As the Silvari fleet jumped away, Jake stood on the bridge with Luna, and they watched the beautiful ships disappear one by one until only the stars remained. Luna turned to Him asked where they should go next, and Jake grinned and said he had a cargo run to a mining colony that would pay well, and Luna laughed and said it sounded perfect. They set course and jumped into hyperspace, and as the ship hummed around them, Jake realized that his life had changed forever, and he would never be just a simple cargo hauler again. But that was okay because he had found something more valuable than any cargo, and that was a friend who would stand with him through anything, and the knowledge that sometimes one person really could make a difference. 6 months passed after the incident with the military cruisers, and life had settled into a new rhythm for Jake and Luna, as they traveled from colony to colony hauling cargo and occasionally taking on passengers who needed discreet transport. The story of the human captain who earned the loyalty of the Dragon Riders had spread far and wide, and Jake found himself recognized in almost every port he docked at, and while the attention was sometimes annoying, it did bring good business. Luna had become an essential part of his crew, and she could pilot the ship better than Jake could now. And she had a natural talent for navigation and finding the fastest routes through hyperspace that saved them time, and fuel spark and Ember had grown significantly since the suppression device was removed, and they were now the size of large dogs, and their scales had deepened to rich crimson and bright orange, and they could breathe fire hot enough to cut through metal. The dragons spent most of their time in the cargo bay, where Jake had built them a special area with heat-resistant panels, and they would practice flying and breathing fire while Luna monitored their progress. Jake had grown close to Luna over the months, and they worked together like they had been partners for years, and sometimes he would catch himself watching her as she piloted the ship and thinking how lucky he was that she had chosen to stay. They had visited several colony worlds and stations, and everywhere they went, people wanted to hear the story firsthand, and Jake always let Luna tell it. Because it was her story more than his, Luna would describe the research facility, and her escape, and Jake's decision to protect her, and every time she told it, Jake would feel embarrassed but also proud because he had done the right thing, even when it was dangerous. The core worlds had gone quiet after the incident, and while they never officially apologized for the research programs, they had shut down several facilities and released a handful of silvery prisoners who were reunited with their families. Darian, the young warrior who had talked to Jake about his missing sister, sent word through the silvery network that his sister had been found alive and freed, and he wanted Jake to know that it was because of what he had done. Jake kept the crystal pendant that Kira had given him on a chain around his neck, and sometimes he would hold it and feel the warmth of it, and know that somewhere out in the galaxy the Dragon Riders were watching over him. One day they received a message from Kira herself, asking if Jake and Luna would be willing to come to the Silveri homeworld, because the Council of Elders wanted to meet the human who had changed. So much Luna was excited, and she asked Jake if he wanted to go, and he said yes without hesitation, because he had been curious about the hidden world since he first heard about it. They set course for the coordinates that Kira provided, and after 3 days of travel they arrived at a seemingly empty region of space, but Luna told Jake to trust her, and she input a special command into the navigation system. Suddenly a world appeared before them, as if materializing out of nothing, and it was the most beautiful thing Jake had ever seen, and it was covered in forests and oceans and cities that glowed with soft, multicolored light. Silveri ships appeared around them, and guided Jake's freighter down through the atmosphere, and as they descended, Jake could see the massive trees that Luna had described, and they were incredible towering structures that reached up into the clouds. They landed on a platform made of living wood that had somehow been shaped into a perfect landing pad. And when Jake stepped out of his ship, the air smelled like flowers and fresh rain, and something else he could not identify. Kira was waiting for them along with dozens of other silvery and dragons of all sizes, and when Jake walked down the ramp they all bowed to him again, and he still felt uncomfortable with that level of respect. Luna took his hand and led him through the city, and Jake stared in wonder at everything he saw because the architecture was unlike anything humans had ever built, and it seemed to grow naturally rather than being constructed. The buildings were formed from living trees that had been guided into specific shapes, and they were connected by bridges of woven vines that were strong enough to support even the largest. Dragon Silveri walked everywhere, and they all stopped to look at Jake with curiosity and respect, and many of them thanked him for what he had done for Luna, and for bringing attention to their people's suffering. Children ran up to him and asked, To see his ship, an adult Silveri offered him gifts of food and art, and Jake tried to accept graciously, even though he felt overwhelmed by all the attention. That evening, Kira brought Jake and Luna to the council chamber, which was a massive structure, built at the top of the tallest tree, and the view from there stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The council of elders sat in a circle, and they were the oldest and wisest of the Silvari, and their dragons lay behind them, and some of those dragons were truly ancient and enormous, with scales that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The eldest among them, a man whose name was Theron, spoke to Jake, and his voice was like thunder and wind and the deep roots of mountains, and he thanked Jake for his courage and his compassion. Theron said that the Silvari had been observing humanity for many years, and they had seen both the best and worst of what the young species was capable of, and they had debated whether humans were ready to know about the Silvari fully. Jake's actions had helped tip that debate in favor of contact, because he had proven that individual humans could rise above their nature's fear and selfishness and show true nobility of spirit. The council had decided to reveal themselves more openly to humanity and to begin formal diplomatic relations with the colonies and the independent worlds, though they would still avoid the core worlds for now. They wanted Jake to be part of this process because he understood both humans and Silvari, and he could help bridge the gap between the two species and prevent misunderstandings. Jake was stunned by this, and he told the council that he was just a cargo hauler and not a diplomat. But Theron smiled and said that sometimes the best diplomats were those who never sought the role. Luna squeezed his hand and told him that he would not be alone because she would be with him, and so would Spark and Ember and the entire Silvari fleet if needed over. The next few days, Jake met with various Silvari leaders and scholars, and they taught him about their history and culture, and he taught them about human customs and ways of thinking. He learned that the Silvari had originally come from another galaxy, entirely, and they had traveled for thousands of years searching for a place where they could live in peace with their dragon partners. They had found this world in a hidden corner of space, and they had used their advanced technology to shield it from detection. And here they had built a civilization based on harmony with nature and respect for all life. Jake told them about humanity's struggles and conflicts and how humans often fought among themselves and destroyed their environments, but also how humans could show incredible resilience and creativity when faced with challenges. The Silvari listened with interest, and they said that humanity reminded them of their own people in ancient times, when they too were young and violent and still learning how to live with wisdom. Theron told Jake that every species went through these growing pains, and that the Silvari saw great potential in humanity, and they wanted to help guide humans toward a better future. Before Jake left the home world, Kira gave him another gift, and it was a small dragon egg about the size of his fist, and it pulsed with inner warmth and light. She explained that this was an incredible honor, and that if Jake accepted the egg and it hatched for him, he would become the first human to ever bond with a dragon. Jake held the egg carefully and felt its warmth seeping into his hands, and he looked at Luna, and she was crying, happy tears, and nodding encouragingly. He accepted the egg and thanked Kira and the council, and he promised that he would care for it and honor the bond if the dragon chose him. Luna helped him build a special incubation chamber on his ship, and she taught him how to monitor the egg's development and what signs to look for when it was ready to hatch as they prepared to leave the homeworld. Hundreds of Silvari came to see them off, and they brought gifts and well wishes, and many of them thanked Jake again for changing their world. Jake stood at the top of his ship's ramp and looked out at the gathering, and he realized that 6 months ago he had been alone, and now he had friends across an entire species and a dragon egg that might change his life forever. Luna stood beside him with Spark and Ember on her shoulders, and she said that this was only the beginning, and that together they would help build a bridge between humans and Silvari that would last for generations. They took off from the home world, and as they climbed through the atmosphere, Jake looked back at the beautiful forests and glowing cities, and he knew he would return someday. The ship jumped into hyperspace, and Jake sat in his captain's chair with the dragon egg resting in a special holder beside him and Luna at the helm guiding them toward their next destination. He thought about everything that had happened since that morning when he found Luna hiding naked in his cargo bay, and how one simple choice to help someone in need had led to all of this. Jake had never wanted to be a hero or a diplomat or a bridge between species. But life had pushed him into these roles, and he had discovered that he was capable of more than he ever imagined.